The restaurant stood on a busy street, always full of soft lights, quiet conversations, and the gentle sound of cutlery touching plates. People came there to relax after long days, to celebrate small moments, or simply to enjoy a warm meal in a calm place. In the corner of the room, near a tall window, there was a piano. It was polished and beautiful, but most nights, it stayed silent. Sometimes a performer would come and play, but on many evenings, it was just part of the decoration. Among the staff, there was one waitress who almost nobody noticed. She moved quietly between tables, never drawing attention to herself. Her steps were light, her voice soft, and her eyes often lowered as she worked. She always did her job well. Orders were correct, plates were served on time, and she never forgot a detail. Still, people rarely remembered her face. She wasn't the kind of person who spoke unless needed. While the other staff joked and laughed during short breaks, she usually stayed at the side, listening more than talking. It wasn't that she didn't understand them. She just seemed more comfortable in silence. Her day started early and ended late. Before the restaurant opened, she would help clean the tables, arrange chairs, and prepare everything for the guests. When the doors finally opened, she became part of the quiet rhythm of the place. Step by step, table by table, she moved through the evening like a shadow. There was something about her, though, that didn't match the simple life she showed on the outside. Sometimes, when no one was paying attention, she would pause for a second near the piano. It was never long enough for others to question it. Just a moment, a glance, a soft breath. Then she would walk away again, carrying a tray or taking an order, as if nothing had happened. One of the older workers had noticed this a few times. He once watched her stand near the piano after closing time. The lights were dim, and the room was almost empty. She didn't touch the instrument. She just stood there, looking at it in a way that felt personal, like it meant something more to her than it did to anyone else. But he didn't ask. In a place where everyone had their own struggles, people learned not to dig too deep unless invited. Customers came and went. Some were kind, some were demanding, and some didn't even make eye contact when she served them. She treated them all the same, with quiet patience. Even when someone spoke harshly or complained for no clear reason, she didn't react. She would nod gently, fix the issue, and move on. To most people, she was just another worker doing her job. One evening, the restaurant was especially crowded. A small event had brought in more guests than usual, and the staff was moving quickly to keep up. Laughter filled the air, glasses clinked, and voices overlapped in a warm, busy noise. In the middle of it all, she moved with calm focus, never rushing, never showing stress. At one table, a group of guests talked about music. They were discussing performances they had seen, concerts they had attended, and the feeling of hearing something truly beautiful. One of them pointed toward the piano and said it was a shame it wasn't being used that night. She happened to be standing nearby, placing a dish on the table. For a second, her hands slowed. Not enough for anyone to notice, but inside, something shifted. She didn't look up. She didn't say anything. She just finished her task and quietly walked away. Later that night, when things became less busy, she was asked to take a short break. She stepped outside for a moment, standing near the back door where the noise from inside became softer. The air was cooler there. She closed her eyes for a few seconds, taking a deep breath. It wasn't just physical tiredness. There was something else she carried, something heavier, quieter. When she went back inside, the lights seemed brighter again, and the sound of people returned to full strength. She picked up her tray and continued working, just as she always did. As the evening moved forward, the crowd slowly began to thin. One by one, guests finished their meals and left. The noise softened, turning into a calm background hum. The staff began preparing for closing time, wiping tables and stacking chairs. She was assigned to clean the area near the piano. Carefully, she wiped the surface, making sure not to leave a single mark. Her movements were slow and gentle, almost as if she was afraid of damaging something delicate. When she finished, she stood there for a moment. This time, no one was watching. Her hand lifted slightly, hovering above the keys. She didn't press them. Not yet. Her fingers stayed in the air, as if remembering something. Then, slowly, she lowered her hand and stepped back. A small sigh escaped her lips, so soft it could barely be heard. It was clear that whatever connection she had with the piano, it wasn't simple. It wasn't just interest. It felt deeper, like a memory she wasn't ready to face fully. From across the room, one of the workers called her name, asking for help with something. She quickly turned and walked away, leaving the piano behind once again. The night ended like every other night. The doors were locked, the lights were turned off, and the staff went home. She walked alone along the quiet street, her steps steady and unhurried. The world outside was different from the warm glow of the restaurant. It was darker, quieter, and more real. Passing cars made brief sounds, and distant lights flickered in the distance. She carried no sign of anything unusual. No one who saw her would think there was something special about her story. But inside, there was a silence that held more than words could explain. The next day, everything would repeat again. The same tables, the same routine, the same quiet presence moving through the room. And the piano would still be there, waiting in the corner, holding a story that had not yet been told. For now, she remained what everyone believed her to be, just a silent waitress. The days continued to pass in the same quiet rhythm, but something about her began to feel a little more noticeable, at least to those who paid close attention. It wasn't anything loud or obvious. It was in the small things. The way her fingers moved when she thought no one was looking. The way her steps sometimes matched a rhythm that only she could hear. During busy hours, she stayed focused on her work, just as always. Plates balanced carefully in her hands, her eyes moving from table to table, making sure nothing was missed. But even in the middle of all that noise, there were moments when her mind seemed to drift somewhere else. One afternoon, the restaurant was quieter than usual. Only a few tables were occupied, and the soft sound of a ceiling fan filled the empty spaces. She was standing behind the counter, waiting for the next order, when her fingers began tapping lightly against the wooden surface. First it was random, then slowly it turned into something more structured. Pattern, a rhythm, left hand, then right, then both together. It wasn't loud enough for anyone to notice clearly, but it had a shape, a quiet kind of music without sound. A coworker standing nearby looked over and smiled slightly. "You always do that," he said casually. "Like you're playing something." She immediately stopped, pulling her hands back as if she had been caught doing something she wasn't supposed to. She gave a small, polite smile but said nothing. "Do you play?" he asked, not expecting much of an answer. She shook her head gently. "Not really," she replied in a soft voice. He didn't push further. It didn't seem like something she wanted to talk about. Still, there was a look in his eyes that showed curiosity. He had seen that kind of movement before. People who played instruments often had it without even realizing. Later that day, while clearing a table, she overheard a conversation between two guests. They were talking about a child who had recently started learning piano. One of them mentioned how difficult it was at first, how it took patience and practice. She paused for just a second longer than usual while picking up a glass. Her eyes dropped slightly, and a faint memory seemed to pass through her expression. Then, just like always, she moved on. That evening, after most of the staff had left, she stayed behind for a few extra minutes. It wasn't unusual. Sometimes she helped finish small tasks before heading home. The lights were dimmer now, and the restaurant felt completely different without the crowd. The piano stood quietly in its place, untouched once again. She looked around to make sure no one was nearby. Then, slowly, she walked toward it. Her steps were careful, almost hesitant, like she wasn't sure if she should be doing this at all. When she reached the piano, she stood still for a moment, her hands resting at her sides. Then, with a quiet breath, she sat down. The bench made a soft sound as she adjusted her position. Her hands rested on her lap, fingers slightly curled, as if they were already remembering something before even touching the keys. For a few seconds, she didn't move. Then, very slowly, She lifted her hands and placed them gently on the piano. The first note she played was so soft it almost didn't exist. Just a single sound, light and careful. She paused after it, listening as if testing whether it was real. Then came another note. And another. First it was simple, slow, almost unsure. But there was something in the way she played that didn't match a beginner. Her fingers moved with a kind of memory, even if her mind seemed cautious. The melody began to form quietly, like a whisper. It wasn't perfect. There were small pauses, moments where her hands hesitated. But even in those pauses there was feeling. Real feeling. Her shoulders slowly relaxed. Her breathing became steady. And little by little the music grew more confident. It was as if something inside her had been locked away for a long time, and now it was finding a way back out. Her fingers began to move more freely, gliding across the keys with a natural flow. The simple melody turned into something deeper, something fuller. Carried emotion, soft at first, then slowly rising. In that empty restaurant, with no audience and no applause, she played as if she was speaking without words. Time seemed to slow down. For those few minutes, she wasn't just a waitress. She wasn't someone trying to stay unnoticed. She was something else entirely. Someone connected to the music in a way that felt honest and real. Then suddenly, a small noise broke the silence. She froze. Her hands lifted quickly from the keys, and her heart began to race. She turned her head toward the sound. It was just a chair shifting slightly from somewhere in the room. Nothing serious. But it was enough. The moment was gone. She stood up quickly, stepping away from the piano as if she had done something wrong. Her calm expression returned, but there was a hint of worry in her eyes. Without looking back, she picked up her things and left. That night, as she walked home, her mind was not quiet anymore. The music she had played stayed with her, repeating softly in her thoughts. It had been a long time since she allowed herself to do that. A long time since she let that part of her come alive. The next day, she returned to work as usual. Nothing had changed on the outside. The same uniform, the same quiet steps, the same soft voice. But inside, something was different. The connection she tried to keep hidden had started to surface again. And even though no one fully understood it yet, the signs were there. Small, quiet, and easy to miss. But not invisible. Not anymore. The following days felt a little heavier for her, even though everything around her stayed the same. The restaurant still opened at the same time. The same lights turned on. The same soft music played in the background. And the same crowd of people came and left without noticing much about the quiet waitress moving between tables. But inside her, something had shifted after that night with the piano. She didn't talk about it. Not to anyone. Not even in passing. She simply went back to her routine, as if nothing had happened. But her mind kept returning to those moments. Her fingers touching the keys, the sound of the first soft notes, and the way her chest had felt strangely light, even if only for a short time. She tried to ignore it during work hours. She focused harder on her tasks, made sure she stayed busy, and avoided standing too long near the piano corner. Still, her eyes sometimes drifted there without permission. Just a quick glance, then she would look away again, as if afraid someone might notice. One evening, the restaurant prepared for a small special event. It was not a big celebration, but there were more guests than usual. Tables were arranged neatly, candles were placed carefully, and everything had a slightly more formal feel than normal nights. The staff was told to be extra attentive, as a few important guests were expected. She worked quietly as always, moving from table to table. The restaurant filled with soft conversation and polite laughter. Everything seemed smooth at first. But as the evening moved forward, a small problem began to grow. The person who usually played piano for such events did not arrive. At first, no one paid much attention. People assumed there had been a delay. But as time passed, it became clear that the performer was not coming. The staff began to feel a quiet pressure. Guests were already seated, expecting a pleasant atmosphere with live music. The manager looked around, clearly stressed. The piano stood in its corner, silent and unused, like a reminder that something important was missing. People began to talk in low voices. What should be done? Should they try to call someone? Should they apologize to the guests? The mood slowly shifted from relaxed to uncertain. She noticed the change, even while serving drinks at a nearby table. She could feel the tension in the air, the way people were suddenly more alert, more worried. She kept her head down and continued working, not wanting to be part of the discussion. But then something unexpected happened. A few staff members, trying to lighten the situation, made a passing comment. One of them jokingly said that maybe someone from inside could play for a short time, just to keep the evening going. It was meant as a harmless suggestion, not a serious idea. A couple of people laughed softly. Others shook their heads. It didn't seem realistic. After all, this was not something just anyone could do. Then someone glanced toward her. It wasn't planned. It wasn't serious at first. Just a casual look, followed by a half-joking comment. Why not her? The room became quiet for a second. She stopped moving. The tray she was holding felt heavier suddenly. She looked up slowly, not fully understanding at first if they were speaking about her or just joking. A few eyes turned toward her now. Some curious, some doubtful, some surprised. She immediately shook her head slightly, as if to say no without words. Her expression stayed calm, but inside she felt something tighten. This was not something she wanted attention for. She was just here to work. Nothing more. But the suggestion didn't disappear so easily. The manager, still stressed about the missing performer, looked at her more carefully now. He didn't say anything immediately. He seemed to be thinking. The guests were waiting. The piano was there. And time was moving. Someone else spoke quietly, saying it might be better than nothing. Just a simple piece. Something soft. Something short. Enough to keep the atmosphere alive. She stepped back slightly, almost as if the idea itself was pushing her away. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was very soft. I don't really play, she said. It was not loud. It was not confident. But it was clear. For a moment, it seemed like the conversation would end there. But the silence that followed made everything feel heavier. The guests nearby had started to notice that something was happening. A few were now looking in their direction, curious about the sudden attention near the piano. The manager sighed. There was no time left for searching someone else. The evening needed something. He looked at her again, this time more seriously. Just try, he said gently. Only if you are comfortable. She didn't answer right away. Her hands tightened slightly around the edge of the tray. Her thoughts moved quickly, but not loudly. She was thinking of every reason to refuse. Every reason to walk away. This was not something she wanted to be seen doing. Not here. Not like this. But something else was also there. A quiet memory. The piano. The sound she had heard in her own hands just days before. She looked toward the corner where it stood. Silent. Waiting. The room felt like it was holding its breath. Slowly, she placed the tray down. Carefully. Almost as if she was afraid even that small sound might change everything. Then she took a step forward. No one spoke. Her movement was slow, uncertain, but steady. One step, then another. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if she was walking toward something she had avoided for a long time. When she reached the piano, she paused again. The entire room felt distant now. The conversations had stopped. Even the background noise seemed to fade slightly. She stood there for a moment, looking at the instrument. It felt familiar in a way she didn't fully understand how to explain. Then, quietly, she sat down. The bench creaked softly under her weight. Her hands rested in her lap at first. Still, careful, like she was waiting for permission from herself. Behind her, the room remained silent. She closed her eyes for a brief second. And then she placed her fingers on the keys. The first note she played was soft, almost uncertain, but it was real. And in that moment, everything was about to change. The first note she played seemed to hang in the air longer than usual, as if the entire room was holding it carefully before letting it go. It was soft, unsure, and almost fragile. For a brief moment, nothing else happened. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the sound of glasses and distant kitchen noise felt like it had faded into another world. She kept her eyes lowered, focused only on the keys. Her fingers stayed close, not rushing, not forcing anything. It felt like she was testing something, like she was trying to remember a language she had not spoken in a long time. The second note came a little more steady, still soft, but no longer uncertain. Then another followed. Slowly, a simple pattern began to form. It was not complicated. It was not impressive yet, but it was real, and it had feeling. In the beginning, some of the guests were still unsure of what was happening. A few leaned back in their chairs, watching with mild curiosity rather than expectation. They had not been prepared for this. Most of them thought it would be a short attempt, maybe even awkward, something to fill the silence until a proper solution was found. But as she continued, something began to shift. Her breathing steadied. Her shoulders, which had been slightly tense, started to relax. Her fingers moved with more confidence, even if only slightly. The notes became clearer, smoother, more connected. It was still a simple melody, but it was growing. There was a kind of honesty in the way she played. No decoration, no show, just sound coming out in its purest form. A few people at the tables exchanged quiet looks. Not because they were impressed yet, but because they were surprised by how calm she seemed now. The nervousness they expected was not fully there anymore. Instead, there was something else building slowly in her presence. She didn't look at the audience. She didn't check their reactions. It was as if the room no longer existed in the same way. Only the piano mattered. The melody changed slightly, not suddenly, but gently, like water finding a new direction. The simple pattern she started with began to stretch, opening into something wider. Her right hand started to move a little more freely, adding small changes, small expressions. The left hand followed with soft, steady support. Now the sound was no longer just notes. It had shape. It had movement. The room, which had still been restless at the beginning, became noticeably quieter. Conversations stopped one by one. Chairs stopped moving. Even people who had not been paying attention before started turning their heads toward the piano. She was still the same person sitting there, in the same simple uniform, in the same quiet posture. But something about her presence was changing the space around her. Her fingers moved a little faster now, not rushed, but more certain. The melody grew stronger, more connected. There was a feeling in it that people could not easily ignore. It wasn't loud or dramatic yet, but it carried emotion that slowly pulled attention closer. One guest leaned slightly forward, as if trying to understand what they were hearing. Another paused mid-conversation, forgetting what they were about to say. The restaurant, which had once been full of soft noise, now felt like it was slowly narrowing its focus to one point. Her expression remained calm, but inside, something was shifting. The fear she felt earlier had not completely disappeared, but it was no longer in control. It was sitting quietly in the background now, like a shadow that no longer guided her movement. She played a small variation in the melody, something unexpected. It was simple, but it carried emotion in a deeper way. A few notes lingered slightly longer, creating a gentle tension before resolving into softness again. The sound felt like a conversation without words. Her hands moved more naturally now, as if they were remembering something instead of learning it again. The music became smoother, more flowing. Each phrase connected to the next in a way that felt less planned and more felt. A few people in the room exchanged another look, this time different from before. It was no longer just curiosity. There was recognition of something they did not expect to witness in such a place, at such a moment. She continued without stopping. Her posture remained steady, but there was a quiet change in her energy. The earlier hesitation had faded almost completely. Now there was only focus. The melody deepened slightly, not louder but richer. The notes carried more weight, more meaning. It was still gentle, but it was no longer simple. It was becoming expressive, like a story unfolding step by step. Somewhere in the middle of the room, a glass was placed down more carefully than before, as if even small sounds needed to be controlled now. A server paused while walking, holding still for a moment just to listen. The atmosphere had changed without anyone realizing exactly when it happened. She added a small pause in the music. A brief silence. Then she continued, but in a slightly different direction. The shift was subtle, but noticeable to those paying attention. The melody now had contrast, soft rises and gentle falls, like breathing. Her fingers moved with more confidence than before. Not fast, not showy, but controlled and expressive. The piano was no longer something she was unsure of. It was becoming something she was speaking through. In the background, the restaurant felt like it was holding still. Even people who had not planned to listen were now completely aware of her. Not because she demanded attention, but because the sound itself made it difficult to ignore. She remained focused, eyes still lowered, fully absorbed in what she was doing. There was no sign of performance in the way she played. It felt more like expression than presentation. The melody grew slightly stronger again, rising gently before softening once more. It carried a quiet emotion that could not be easily named. It wasn't happy or sad in a clear way. It was something in between, something deeper, more human. A few guests leaned in closer without realizing it. The room felt smaller now, as if everything outside the piano had faded a little further away. Her hands moved in a steady rhythm, no longer hesitant. Each note followed the next with increasing clarity. The confidence was not sudden, but it was real. It had been building quietly from the moment she first touched the keys. She played a short sequence that felt almost like a breath being released after being held for too long. The sound softened at the end of it, creating a gentle pause in the air. For a brief moment, she slowed down again. Not because she was unsure, but because the music itself seemed to ask for space. The room remained silent, and in that silence, something was beginning to form. Something no one in that place had expected when the evening began. She was still just a waitress in appearance. But the sound she was creating was already starting to change the way people saw her. The silence in the room was no longer empty. It was full now, but in a different way than before. It was not the kind of silence that felt awkward or uncomfortable. It was the kind that held attention, like everyone was afraid that even a small sound might break something important. She continued playing. Her hands moved with more ease now, as if the piano was no longer something unfamiliar. The melody that had started softly earlier was now richer, deeper, and more expressive. Carried a flow that felt natural, not forced. Every note seemed to have a place. Every pause seemed to have meaning. People were no longer casually watching. They were listening. Some leaned slightly forward in their seats without realizing it. Others had stopped eating entirely. Even those who had not planned to stay focused on anything had now turned fully toward the piano. The atmosphere of the restaurant had changed completely. It no longer felt like a dining space. It felt like something else entirely. Something quieter, something more connected. She remained unaware of all this at first. Her focus stayed on the keys. Her world narrowed to the sound under her fingers. But as she continued, she slowly began to feel it. The attention. Not loud, not overwhelming, but present. Still, she did not look up. The music began to grow in strength. Not in volume, but in emotion. There was a rising feeling in it, like a wave slowly building. The melody shifted slightly, becoming more complex, more layered. It was still gentle, but now it had depth. A few guests exchanged quiet looks. Not of doubt anymore. Not of confusion. But of something closer to surprise. Even disbelief. Because what they were hearing did not match what they expected. She added a soft variation in the rhythm. It was small, almost hidden, but it changed the direction of the piece slightly. The sound moved from calm reflection into something more expressive. It felt like the music was telling a story without words. Her fingers moved with growing confidence. The hesitation from earlier was gone now. In its place was control. Not the kind that felt strict or mechanical, but the kind that came from understanding. The melody swelled gently, then softened again, like breathing in and out. Each rise and fall felt intentional but also natural. There was a balance in it that made people want to keep listening. At one table, someone placed their fork down and did not pick it up again. At another, a conversation had completely stopped, forgotten mid-sentence. Even the staff who were not directly involved in the event stood still for a moment, watching from a distance. She had not said a single word, but the room was listening to her completely. The music reached a slightly higher point now. Not dramatic, but emotional. There was a feeling of release in it, like something long held inside was finally finding a way out. It carried a quiet intensity that was difficult to explain. Her shoulders stayed relaxed. Her breathing was steady. Her expression remained calm. But the music showed something deeper. Something that had not been visible before. The melody began to spread through the room more fully. It was no longer just coming from the piano in a corner. It felt like it was filling the space itself. Every note seemed to reach further than the last. A guest near the back of the room whispered something under their breath, but it was not a comment. It was more like surprise that could not be held in. She continued without breaking focus. Her hands now moved with a natural rhythm that did not feel learned in that moment. Felt remembered, as if the music had always been there, and she was simply letting it come through. The piece shifted again. This time, the change was more noticeable. The melody became softer for a moment, almost delicate. Then it slowly rebuilt itself, gaining strength again, but in a different shape than before. It was not repeating. It was evolving. The room remained completely quiet now. Even the smallest background sounds felt distant. The only thing that seemed real was the piano and the person playing it. She added a gentle pause in the middle of the phrase. It was short, but it created a strong effect. The silence after it felt meaningful, like the room was waiting for what would come next. Then she continued. The next notes were fuller, more connected. They carried a sense of direction, like the music was now moving towards something important. There was a growing emotion in it that could not be ignored anymore. A few people looked visibly affected. Not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, internal way. Something about the music was reaching them differently than expected. She did not react to the audience. But something inside her had changed slightly. There was a sense of flow now. No resistance. No hesitation. Just movement. Her fingers were no longer thinking about each note. They were simply following the sound. The melody reached another peak. Still controlled, still gentle but powerful in feeling. It carried a sense of release, like something breaking free after being held for too long. The room felt completely absorbed. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the idea of interruption seemed impossible in that moment. She played a sequence that felt like the center of everything she had been building. It was not the loudest part, but it was the most expressive. It held everything together. And then, slowly, it began to soften again. The intensity did not disappear. It simply changed form. The music became lighter, more reflective. It felt like the end of a journey slowly coming into view. Her hands slowed slightly, but stayed steady. Each note now felt more intentional, more careful. Like she was bringing something to a close rather than stopping suddenly. The final part of the phrase arrived gently. No sudden end. No sharp stop. Just a soft landing of sound. And then she held the last note a little longer than expected. It lingered in the air. For a moment nothing followed it. The room stayed completely still. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as if everyone was waiting to make sure it was truly over. She slowly lifted her hands from the keys. Her head remained lowered. And for the first time since she began playing, she felt the weight of the room fully around her. Not as pressure, but as awareness. She had not said anything. She had not explained anything. But something had changed in that room, and everyone there knew it. For a few seconds after the last note faded, the entire room stayed completely still. It was not the kind of silence that comes from confusion. It was the kind that comes when something powerful has just ended and no one is ready to break the moment. She remained seated for a moment longer, her hands resting lightly above her lap. She did not move right away. It felt as if she herself needed a second to understand what had just happened. Her breathing was slow, steady, but there was a quiet tension in her chest, like she had stepped out of something deep and emotional. Then, slowly, she lowered her hands fully. No one spoke. At first, it felt like the audience had forgotten how to react. People looked at each other, but no one made a sound. It was as if they were all waiting for someone else to confirm that what they had just heard was real. And then it happened. A single clap, then another, started slowly from just one table. Then another joined in, and soon it grew. The sound of applause began to fill the restaurant, spreading through the room like a wave that could not be stopped. She stayed where she was for a moment, still looking down. It was not something she was used to. Attention like this. Eyes on her. Applause that felt heavy with meaning. She finally stood up slowly. Her movements were careful, almost shy. She turned slightly toward the room, not fully facing it at first. Her expression was calm, but there was something different in her eyes now. Something softer. Something that had not been seen before. The applause continued, stronger now. Some people even stood up without realizing it. It was not just polite clapping. It was genuine reaction. Surprise. Respect. Emotion. She gave a small, hesitant nod. Not a performance gesture. Just a quiet acknowledgement. Then she stepped away from the piano. As she walked back, she felt something strange. The same space she had moved through for so long now felt different. The tables she had served. The people she had passed without notice. Everything seemed to look at her differently now. But she did not say anything. She simply returned to the side of the room, where she usually stood. One of the staff members looked at her with disbelief, as if trying to understand how something like this had been hidden in plain sight all along. Another looked almost speechless, not knowing what to say. She just lowered her head slightly, as if to return to normal. But normal had already changed. At the tables, guests were still talking quietly about what they had just experienced. Some were describing it in short sentences, still trying to process it. Others were simply shaking their heads, smiling in disbelief. A few remained silent, as if the experience had left them without the need for words. One guest mentioned that they had never expected something like that in a place like this. Another said it felt like the room had turned into something else entirely for a few minutes. Not a restaurant. Something more personal. Something emotional. And at the center of all those reactions, she stood quietly, now holding a tray again, as if trying to return to her usual role. But no one was looking at her the same way anymore. Even when she moved to clear a table, people watched her differently. Not with curiosity now, but with recognition. Like they had just seen a side of her that could not be unseen. She tried to continue her work, but things were not the same. The manager approached her slowly after some time. He did not speak immediately. He seemed unsure how to begin. Then, with a calm voice, he simply thanked her. She gave a small nod. Nothing more. But inside the restaurant, something had already shifted permanently. That evening, after the guests left and the noise slowly faded, the place returned to its quiet state. Tables were cleaned. Lights were dimmed. Chairs were placed in order again. But the energy of what had happened still remained in the air. She stayed a little longer than usual, helping with small tasks. Her movements were the same as always, but now there was something different in the way people responded to her presence. No one ignored her anymore. Still, she did not act differently. She did not seek attention. She did not talk about what had happened. It was as if she was trying to hold onto her usual silence, even after everything had changed. When she finally finished her work and prepared to leave, she walked toward the exit slowly. The piano stood in the corner again, quiet and still just like before. But now it no longer felt invisible. Felt remembered. She stopped for a moment near it. Not long. Just enough. Then she walked out. Outside, the night air felt cool and calm. The street was quieter now than the restaurant had been earlier. She stood there for a moment, looking ahead without a clear expression. For the first time in a long while, something inside her felt lighter. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just different. The next day, everything in the restaurant continued as usual on the surface. Orders were taken, tables were served, and guests came and went. But underneath that routine, something had changed. People looked at her more carefully now. Some smiled when she passed. Some nodded. Some simply watched in quiet respect. She still did her work the same way. Calm, quiet, focused. But now there was a difference in how she was seen. And sometimes, when she passed the piano, she no longer avoided it as quickly as before. Just a brief pause. A small glance. As if something that had been hidden for a long time had finally found a small space to exist. And though she said nothing about it, those who had been in the room that night would never forget what they saw. Not just a performance, but a moment when a silent presence became something unforgettable. And from that day forward, the quiet waitress was no longer just someone who went unnoticed. She was someone who had been heard,